Well, it's been a while since I've done a podcast, but I want to welcome this time someone very unique. She is a former MI5 British Security Service officer. Her name is Mrs. Annie Machon. She now is located in Dusseldorf, Germany, and she acquired some prominence due to the fact that her and her, at the time, partner David Shayler were involved in what's known as the Shayler Affair. And if you go to the Guardian's website, you'll find a whole host of articles dealing with that issue. She worked for the Ministry of Truth in Oceania for many years. I'm sorry, that was a bad joke. That was a bad joke. She is the author of the 2005 book Spies, Lies, and Whistleblowers, MI5, MI6, and the Shayler Affair, where she offers criticism of the security service and the way it operates. She has been involved in speaking on issues like 9/11, been critical of the official version. She is also an intelligence expert. She deals with now geopolitics of all sorts. If you find her website, animation.com, you'll find all kinds of lectures and interviews on Russia Today. And so I want to thank Mrs. Annie Machon for joining me today.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on.
All right, now let's in the first few chapters of your book, you talk about how you were recruited and the process. Can you go into a little bit of that? Like, how did you, you're at Cambridge, you're studying the classics. Did you ever dream that you would be involved in that kind of work, or was that something that you just thought was too far fetched?
Well, I certainly never wanted to be a spy. I wasn't one of these sort of James Bond enthusiasts. What little I knew about it was really from watching some of the John le Carré programs, films of things like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, with my father when I was in my teens. And I have to say, the whole environment struck me as a sort of very dark, very grey, very misogynistic, unpleasant world to live in,
right.
Which is the way that John le Carré portrays it. So no, it never crossed my mind that I would ever think of being a spy. And I think that's probably true of many people who, certainly in the UK intelligence agencies, get recruited.
Right.
Because, of course, there is this sort of glamorous myth attached to intelligence work. And they do get a lot of applicants from spy wannabes. But they're not the people they tend to recruit.
Well, I noticed that, right away in the book, you begin to bring out the points where you found the work to not be what you thought it was. And was that something that hit you right away, or did it take a while? Was it several years down the road that you started thinking, well, this isn't exactly what I signed up for?
Well, it's pretty straight up, really. I mean, my recruitment was a sort of accidental recruitment, as I mentioned. I actually wanted to be a diplomat, so I applied to join the Foreign Office in the UK, about a year after I'd left Cambridge. And then I had this mysterious note in the post saying there may be other jobs you find more interesting, and my initial response was, oh my god, it's MI5. It was a very frightening idea. I mean, they had a very bad reputation at that point. This was in 1990. Throughout the 1980s in the UK, there had been a huge series of scandals around the MI5 for their involvement in subverting legal strikes, for their involvement in spying on civil libertarians, for all sorts of messy sort of stories, and also whistleblowing stories like Peter Wright, who wrote the notorious book Spy Cat, and was pursued around the world as people busy with that. So I have to say, my initial response was, oh no. But then I did sort of phone the number out of curiosity, and 10 months later found myself recruited to work there. But because of all these scandals, MI5 had, in 1989, been put on a legal footing for the very first time in its history. So it has existed for 80 years at that point, without any democratic oversight, without having to work within the law. But because of all these scandals, a new law was written, which was called the Security Service Act. And after that, they did have to work notionally within legal parameters in order to spy on people. So when being recruited, there's a lot of talk about this by the recruiters, and also about the fact that they wanted a whole new generation of intelligence officers to work for them.
Right.
Because the bad old days of spying on union activists and civil liberties activists and things was in the past. They now wanted people to focus on counter-terrorism type work. So I thought, well, it's not as bad as it's been portrayed in the media. The recruitment process was incredibly intensive and very, very probing. And I was always sort of surprised when I got through the next stage and the next stage. And I sort of thought, well, by the time I was accepted, I thought, well, this job must be right for me. Perhaps they're not as they're portrayed in the media. Perhaps they
Right.
first section. So that was a bit of a sort of very early wake-up call. However, at that point, they were saying this is very sort of historic. They were winding down the study. Obviously, the Soviet Union had crumbled around that time, and all the Cold War was over, so there was no real justification for continuing that study.
Well,
and because of that, I thought, well, perhaps it's just that one section. It's anachronistic, but let's try some other sections. You get posted every 2 years to a different area of work.
well, that brings two questions to mind. Number one, I mean, didn't you sort of expect? Weren't you a little bit suspicious? In other words, didn't you suspect? Well, they're probably not giving me the full picture. I mean, they're trying to sort of sell this to me. I mean, did you not sort of suspect that a government position might not be what it's sold to be? I mean, I think of examples in the U.S. where the Army recruiters, for example. I mean, they'll go to any lengths to recruit people, and many of them have even been found to be operating illegally in terms of the recruitment process because they get bonuses and whatnot. So, did you not suspect, or were you not at all suspicious?
Well, I was 22 at the time, and I suppose quite idealistic. I mean, hindsight is one thing, and looking back now, of course, I'd be suspicious.
Yeah, right.
But at that point, no. And as I said, they had this terrible reputation, but because they've been put on legal footing, because a lot of the questions you were asked during recruitment are about ethics and morality and legality and everything. And I was very honest even then. I mean, I haven't changed my views on those sort of frameworks. They still wanted me back for the next stage and the next stage. So that's why I said it felt like it, they had misportrayed or they had changed, and I was right for the job. But I have to say as well that all through the process, you're never told anything about the work you'll be doing, exactly what it entails. The only thing you know on the day when you get into the front door to begin your training is what grade you're assigned to and what your salary's going to be.
Right.
Which the grade meant nothing, and the salary was appalling. So, you're not going to be informed when you actually sort of start work there.
Well,
but no, I think they get a lot of very idealistic people who want to make a difference.
Yeah.
Being recruited, it's just then the culture there is a problem with that.
Well, I guess I'm just wondering that if there was bad press, and if you knew about that, why do you feel like you were sold something that actually wasn't true, or do you feel like it just turned out to be? Well, I guess I can go ahead. You actually argue that there turned out to be a lot of illegality, that there was cover-ups and criminal activities involved. But the other question I want to ask is that you mentioned misogyny. I mean, don't women sort of make really good spies? I would think that you would have been received very well within that sort of circle. Did you experience misogyny?
Well, to take the first part about them sort of selling a pump and things like that. I think my recruitment process is interesting because when you work for the service, you're actually working as an intelligence officer. People use the spy, but a spy is someone who is infiltrating the organisation and reporting back. An agent is what the UK term is. Of course, in the US, the agent is the person actually employed by the FBI or the CIA. So there's a sort of confusion around that. So in terms of their ethics and everything, when I was recruited, my recruiter, the intelligence officer from Mi5 who handled my case, so to speak, was actually a woman in her late 30s, and she looked like a hippie. I mean, flowy shirts and hair down the hips and all that sort of thing. So she broke every preconception I possibly had about the agency at that time. And as I said, the interest and involvement and awareness of the sort of ethical issues was very present during a lot of my interviews and exercises that I had to do. So that was reassuring, despite their old reputation and the fact that they were on a legal footing from 89. Also was reassuring. They say, well, it's the bad old days, but we've changed now.
Right.
And actually, I think there were people in the organisation who genuinely think that. There were good people working, but the group ethos, the group think, was dominated by the sort of Cold Warriors like the old are, and that's where the problem came in. That's where the block came in, and sort of the problems sort of continued to roll on into existence and not be challenged.
Could you? I'm sorry. The connection got bad there. You said right after groupthink, you mentioned that something was going on. What was that?
Well, it's the fact that the groupthink
okay.
Very entrenched in the sort of old way of thinking.
I see. Okay.
So even though now on a legal footing at that point, they were still thinking back to the days when they could burgle away around London with impunity, as Peter said.
Right.
So their sort of mentality shifted. We ended up with a big culture clash between the officers who were recruited at this time and the old guard who started working the old way. And that's where we've got this friction about, well, we can still cut corners, we can break the law, we can come up with a nice government. And then I think that also did feed, not so much misogynistic, there was a bit of misogyny there, but I mean, you know, you get that anyway deep in those days.
Yeah.
Mi5 certainly made great play of the fact half their staff were female. But in fact, what it meant was most of those staff were clerical or secretarial workers. There were fewer intelligence officers who were female. So that was an issue. But I think as well, the people they could recruit, they weren't necessarily looking at which gender they were. What they were looking at were certain competency skills that person had, which would fit into the work. So yes, going back to the sort of the spy agent fusion as well, a lot of people do like to think, well, it must be great for a woman to be a spy. Well, yes, if you're the spy, if you're the agent and you're the matter figure.
Yeah.
But as an intelligence officer, it doesn't really matter which gender you are. I suppose it might give an advantage when you're trying to prove agent or something, but that's about it.
Well, moving on, you talk about the surveillance of a lot of the left-leaning groups, the Socialist Workers' Party, which you were, I believe you were in charge of, and this was Section F2. And so you started feeling like these groups weren't exactly relevant, and you mentioned the point that the Soviet Union had collapsed. What would you say to the person who made the argument that, well, yeah, the Soviet Union collapsed, but it's not as if when the Soviet Union collapsed, every single person of a sort of far left ideology or of a communist line of thought, that they didn't all suddenly drop all of their views. Do you not consider the possibility that maybe there are still subversive groups, or was it just that you felt that the groups that you were surveilling and keeping tabs on, that you and David found them not to be dangerous?
Well, it's a very multi-layered question. I mean, Mi5 had for decades been incredibly paranoid about the subversive threat, and when I say subversion, their definition was political groups that mean to overthrow or undermine political democracy using political, industrial, or violent means, which is that's their definition, and it's an interesting definition because you're a political group using political methods. How are you undermining the political process? Interestingly, but sure, they were very paranoid about the Communist Party for decades because there'd been this huge spy scandal in the 1950s and 60s, just before the penetration by the Soviet agents into the intelligence agencies, which Mi5 had failed to catch. So they became, as a result of that, particularly, incredibly paranoid, and started trying to record every known possible subversive in the UK. And of course, you've got mission creep. So anyone who's involved with communist groups, which I suppose at that point you could say, well, there was the Soviet Union, they might be funding commie groups within the UK to try and subvert the political system, yes. But then you get mission creep. So not only was it the communist groups, who are still pretty strong even then, it spread to other extreme left-wing groups like the Socialist Workers' Party, as you mentioned, which was not communist, it was Trotskyist, which doesn't ascribe to subversion or entryism, the sort of corrosion within. It subscribes to the democratic will, mass consciousness. So by their own definition, it wasn't even a subversive group. So then you get this position, and then you also crept even further, so that you had a situation where people could have files opened on them and be aggressively investigated by Mi5, purely as question mark, subversive symbolizer. And you could get a file just by being a friend of someone who might be linked to a group like the Communist Party and the SWP. So this mission creep wider and wider, and then anyone who might have that sort of definition attached to them, who is involved in a bona fide political group or civil liberties group, meant that civil liberties group or political group can be aggressively investigated too. So it was way out of hand by the 1970s and 80s, and even former members of Mi5 who've retired have said that it was a shameful period and the coverage of political activists in the UK was way too wide. So that was a concern. But it was winding down, and members of a smallish group, which included David Shayler myself, helped to close down largely. That's done, but it was also officially extended. It was kept on life support for a couple of extra years because in the early 1990s, MI5 knew that it was going to get the need for the investigation of the provisional LRA in the UK. And it was seeing that area of investigation off the Metropolitan Police for the first time in about 150 years. So they knew they were going to get a new area of work, but the announcement was delayed for a couple of years. So they had to sort of keep their staff levels up and find work for idle hands so that their staff went out before they got transitional work coming through. And that's when they actually inflated the threat from subversion, way after the subversive threat has ever disappeared, in order to keep job employees, but it's illegal.
I see. Well, let me ask you now.
Just one other end to that is now we're seeing something similar in the UK. There was a scandal about 5 months ago where an undercover cop.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about because you've written on that, and so I wanted to ask you: has this then now spilled over to the police force? Is something that was previously, illegal wiretapping done by the intelligence agencies, and this now appears to be a sort of being done by the police, if I understand correctly.
Very much so. What happened when MI5 lost interest in looking at subversives, as they call them, in the mid-90s, because they wanted to focus on the much more sort of sexy terrorist work, like the IRA and Middle Eastern terrorism. What happened was that work trickled down to the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, which is the sort of secret police of the lead police organisation in the UK. And they had a section called the SDF, Special Duties Section, where serving policemen went undercover within protest or subversive groups, grew their hair long and lived that life for a number of years and reported back, either police and then to MI5 when MI5 still had an interest, or latter more to the police. So in the late 1990s, it looks like the police were coming out of new areas of work and thought, well, we've got these, all these guys with this skill set, they can penetrate all these groups. Why don't we look at so-called domestic extremists, which is an illegal investigative category anyway, not like subversives. They started using these undercover cops to infiltrate environmental peace protesters. And that's what Mark Kennedy did when he went public at the beginning of the year. He basically came clean and said, yes, that is for 7 years. It was a multi-million-pound investigation. I had to befriend these people, betray them. And also, crucially, what happened is he recorded certain conversations about certain plans these activists made, which highlighted their innocence of crimes for which they were subsequently convicted because those tape recordings were hidden during their trials. So that's partly why public was outed as well. So this sort of mentality, this pervasive paranoia about political version has crept through the system and is still being used. And the organisation that Mark Kennedy and the SDF police officers moved into was something called the National Order Investigations Unit, which was not actually a police organisation. It was run by a senior police federation organisation called ACFO, which is a private company. So they operate inside police, outside any meaning democratic oversight, and effectively outside the law. It's a real problem for the UK democracy.
I see. Let me ask you a question. Do you think democracy works? I want to ask you an ideological question.
Theoretically could. I think it blocked over the decades and centuries and manipulated. But I mean, to be quite frank, I think was it a choice that democracy ain't perfect, but the best we've got.
So it would function better than a monarchy or some sort of. But don't you think though that
well, you're American. You got the monarchy. You and me.
Well, it's funny that it's sort of the same plan that's implemented locally in the U.S. that happens there as well. In other words, the way the wiretapping works in the U.S. is exactly the same. You have the police that are then federalized, and the federal agencies, of course, bribe the police agencies with federal funding if they will implement all these programs and threat fusion centers and whatnot, where you have everyone's phones being tapped and vetted by the NSA and things like that. So it's the same rollout, the entire Western world, I would assume. Um, so
Oh
you're
no, I think the US is fascinating. It's horribly fascinating. Seeing the last days after 9/11, because up until that point there was actually a sort of notion, I think, of check and
yes,
balance,
that's true. Yeah,
and that's
absolutely.
just been shredded post 9/11.
Yes.
And it's like they've sort of learned the worst of the bad habits of the British system, which, I would have said in the 1990s it was the most draconian, most secretive intelligence infrastructure anywhere else in the world, in any Western democracy in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But now, of course, post 9/11, other democracies have been able to scale back their liberties and roll out increased surveillance. So the US has gone careering down a terrible path, Patriot Act and the rest of it,
Well,
to shred liberties.
absolutely. And I thought that was a really interesting point that kept coming up in that frontline debate, and it was the point that you made, and it was that the issue is legality and illegality. The issue is not so much did someone take an oath that they broke, but rather are we going to have the rule of law, or are we going to have covert operations that can do whatever they want with absolutely no accountability or oversight, and that's exactly the same situation here, where you have all sorts of private entities and groups that are able, through the cloak of patriotism and things like that, able to basically do the very opposite of the thing that these entities exist for the purpose of doing, securing the homeland. Well, these entities themselves end up becoming the very threat to the thing that they're supposed to protect.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're sort of all entering really a new scope. Protecting the homeland is a bit like saying war is P, black and white.
Exactly.
Enhanced interrogation.
Sure, right.
It's almost a bit like brainwashing. No, I find it fascinating because there was a lot of coverage a couple of years ago about civil liberties groups. Well, there still is a lot of coverage. Civil liberties groups in Russia being spied on and harassed and having their computers seized on spurious national security grounds. And yet the same thing happens in the US, where the FBI has to date raided various civil liberties groups and seized their computers. And it does tend to make right-wing mainstream press. So it's almost like you're sort of sleepwalking into a Stasi-like state.
Right. Well, let me ask you this. Here's a tough one. It would seem that it would be logical to profile, but profiling goes against sort of egalitarian, democratic, quote-unquote, views. And so we just had, for example, our Homeland Security chief recently say that it makes no logical sense to profile. Well, but every one of the supposed terrorists were Arab Muslims, we're told. So isn't it then logical to profile people? Well, doesn't that follow? In other words, do you see what I'm saying? Where there's a sort of conflict of values between the idea of, quote, civil liberties and not profiling someone, and yet at the same time there are obviously patterns of people who are the supposed terrorists.
Absolutely. I mean, it would be naive to suggest that the intelligence agencies behind the curtain do not profile anyway.
Right.
So, putting that aside, but they do in secret. But then, I mean, in the UK we've had various terrorist problems in many decades. I mean, America seems to act as if, terrorism in the homeland is something new. Well, not for America, but many European countries have been there and done that with a variety of different terrorist flavours over the decades. So, we managed to survive a full-on onslaught from the original IRA for 3 decades in the UK, where things were going off on a regular basis, and where there was a very active discussion of what is an appropriate rollback on civil liberties without ruining our democracy. And it was quite a robust debate, and actually liberties did stand up well for the vast majority of people. And there was, they reached an accommodation in the end, and peace was made in Northern Ireland, so that followed. But I have to say, during that time, the Irish community was victimised. I mean, forget about any sort of profiling or whatever. They were just victimised by the police, and there were many egregious miscarriages of justice in that time. But I think it's very disingenuous of politicians or intelligence commentators now to say, we can't do profiling, we have to treat everyone as a potential terrorist, everyone as a potential criminal
Right.
because of human rights.
Right.
And they use that excuse to have endemic spy powers and to have data mining and to make us all feel like criminals and to make us groom us for a rebirth of state. So they're sort of having their cake and eating it.
Sure.
That argument.
Well, have you seen the video, the planned Opolis video from the BBC? I believe.
No, I haven't.
I believe it's a BBC. It's sort of a tongue-in-cheek presentation of a futuristic city 15, 20 years from now, and if you look it up, it's really telling because everything is completely tracked and controlled. There are food ration cards. It's this big sort of green tyranny where no one has any rights in any sense at all in terms of individual liberties, but it's purely collectivist. Anyway,
it's not that far off there now.
Exactly. Right. And in terms of the environmental laws, I think the UK, from what I understand, it's a lot worse. Now, and you went to Germany. Did you recently relocate because you felt that the UK was just too restrictive and going too far? Is that what happened?
Part of it thinking, absolutely, yes. I mean, I used to joke, that I came here to avoid the increasing fascism of the UK state led to Germany.
Yeah.
Which always makes my German audiences laugh a lot, but not so much in the UK.
Right.
But no, it's true because of course, Germany still embedded in this sort of collective psyche is a fear of what happened before
Right.
the Gestapo,
Right.
fascism, and also the Stasi in Germany, where you couldn't trust your friends, where they could be turned to report against you, press and reporting against you, where you could not leave, you couldn't trust that you could have a private telephone conversation or have a private conversation in your home pretty very open because of my phone.
Yeah.
And this is something as a whistleblower, across these peaks, you get to a situation where you feel like that. I mean, I did live under those sort of terms when I was with David Shayler and we were on the run.
Right.
Something that feels like that, but it's becoming more endemic in the UK. So it's not the environmental laws, although that is the part where, for example, you have there's a new proposed idea is to put microchips or also spy cameras in people's rubbish bins.
Right. Yeah. No,
So
it's insane. Yeah.
And that becomes a sort of base on policing, but also CCTV. I mean, in the UK,
Yeah.
is very covered in CCTV law, but also then you have a whole range of sort of more advanced CCTV. So we have certain towns which even cameras that will talk after you're walking down the street.
Yeah, right.
Where once the errors give you authority, you'll keep it. And where they're now talking about using aerial drones for the same purpose to
Yes.
spoil people
Right.
about their daily business in the UK. And thankfully at the moment, the people who are supplying the police force with those drones are sort of saying, no, we're not going to weaponize them. But who knows how that will.
Well, but I guess what I'm wondering is, and I don't know. I almost went to Germany a couple years ago. I wish I had. Is it not though? More or less the same. I mean, maybe the UK is a little bit ahead, but I mean, isn't it's a global system of tracking and surveillance. So, is it really that much different?
No, I agree. It's a global system. Of course, it's global big business. I mean, it's
Right.
one of the few growth areas in
Yeah.
the global economy is producing these sort of machines to spy on citizenry.
Security, right?
But no, I think because the very sense of the psychological memory, the psychic memory of what it was like to live under the Stasi, or what
Yeah.
it was like to live in the Gestapo, they put in place a very strong constitution, a rock-solid constitution to protect citizens' rights in line with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Okay.
And because of that, even though the German government, of course, is pressured readily to enforce certain rules in the same way as every other Western government in the war on terror, these are challenged in court, and the courts tend to uphold the rights of citizens, the basic constitution. So there is more of a sense of privacy, more of a sense of pushback and a resistance to those sort of aspects. And we see it as the digital civil liberties campaigns. I mean, Germany has got a very robust hacker scene. Hacker's it's a very pejorative word, but in that sense, I mean, people are very switched on to digital privacy and issues around that. And they do fight back against any incursions on those fronts as well. So it is interesting watching how they respond to so-called war on terror. I mean, there was a big flap in last year as well, where there are reports that there's going to be some huge terrorist atrocity in Germany, and the German government was saying, well, I know that, let's respond to this in a sort of calm and measured way. We've seen these sort of wars before, and unless we have something intelligent, we're not going to crack down on us things. And they did. Nothing happened. So.
I see. Well, I want to switch the gears here a little bit and talk about, on that topic, though, going back to the Shayler Affair, you were you whistleblew with your partner at the time, David Shayler, and you talked about the plot to assassinate Gaddafi that had come to his attention. You guys talked about other illegal activities like the wiretapping, the lying to the government, bombs by the IRA that could have been prevented. What I want to ask you is, recently, Sky News and Fox News have been putting out these stories where the intelligence agencies are actually, have been caught openly funding these various groups. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, what it is 14, 15 years makes. And the case that was the straw that broke Camel's back, which resulted in David resigning and David public about the Gaddafi plot,
right.
Was a case of MI6, which is like the CIA, funding an Islamic extremist group in Libya to try and assassinate Gaddafi. And the attack go ahead, but it obviously went wrong because Gaddafi survived, but innocent people died. And crucially, in this case, MI6 did not have the prior written permission of its political master, the Foreign Secretary, which made it illegal under UK law, as well as, highly reckless and immoral, unethical,
right.
and also illegal under international law. But yes, what a difference 15 years makes, because now, of course, unabashedly,
it's it's open. It's open, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And it isn't. In fact, I mean, the reports coming out of the rebel stronghold in Benghazi are ex-royalists who were deposed, thrown out of the country when Gaddafi seized power.
Right.
And crucially, the Islamic Fighting Group, which was
right.
the group funded by MI6 in 1996.
Well, but it's so absurd here. We are told that on the one hand, Al Qaeda is the source of everything nefarious. Al Qaeda did 9/11 and all of these other terrorist events, 7/7 and so on, and yet at the same time we're told, even in the Wall Street Journal, that we are funding, Al Qaeda groups to overthrow Gaddafi, and so this just supreme doublethink is presented, where any person with basic common sense is just sort of astounded. So my question then is, do you think that that's actually a psychological tactic to just go ahead and be that brazenly contradictory, or is it a situation where the assumption is that, well, most people are too stupid to even care or know what's going on in the world? So, or is it both?
Well, I think it's a little patronising to say people are too stupid to care. I think people are so ground down by so many things now that it becomes difficult, perhaps, to care about what's going on in different countries, especially the economic crisis and what have you. But yeah, I mean, wasn't it one of the leading German Nazis who said the bigger the lie, the more people you fool, or something?
Sure, right.
Basic nerds of propaganda.
Right.
So yes, I mean, this apparent sort of contradiction, this apparent doublethink, of course, is picked up by people. Of course, is commented on by people, but it's not going to be covered by the mainstream media. And many people still now get most of their information from their TV stage choice or whatever. So you get things like phone news and things like that, pump out these lies, this doublethink, in such a sort of assertive manner, it becomes difficult to separate fact from fiction, and that's when you get into the doublethink and situation.
But interestingly, of the mainstream sources in news, it's Sky News and Fox News, both News Corp, that have leaked or done these stories about the, Anwar al-Awlaki dining at the Pentagon, and the radical cleric in the UK that was discovered to be being funded by the intelligence agencies in the UK. So in other words, is that itself a psychological warfare technique where a certain institute that's even private, like something like News Corp or Fox News, where it presents conflicting information, or is it a situation where you have different journalists, trying to get the truth out? What's your opinion on that?
Well, again, it's a multi-layered question very much when we come to talk about the mainstream media, the old media, as I call it. Because
right.
so many people now use the internet,
right.
reputable internet to get their news. But no, the old media, I mean, one, you have this sort of conglomeration of ownership. So, for example, you're talking about Fox and Sky, and of course they both belong to News International, which is Rupert Murdoch,
yeah.
Who will set a certain tone depending on which politicians he's backing at that time. But then, of course, you do get to programs with different USPs to give different audiences within that same organisation. And also, journalism editors, one will be lazy, two, a huge time pressure to crank out 24/7 news.
Oh, okay.
Two, some of them, of course, will have linkage to certain government in bodies, certain cats just on me. It doesn't happen to me.
I like cats. That's fun.
Well, Molly, say hello. And so certain sort of journalists will be targeted and groomed to work as sort of agents of influence by the intelligence agencies or certain government departments. So they rely on getting briefing from
right.
organisations to use their stories so that they can earn a living, get a job. But then they have to produce what they are to produce. So you get sort of multi-layered levers of control over the mainstream media. So it's not one big top-down,
right.
saying, yes, this is the tone and this is what this channel is going to say. So there is sort of human layers, pressures from outside, and just, journalism, as it's been called, where they just have to spew out information.
Did you see the film Ghost Rider?
The Tony Blair thing, yes, I did.
What it made me think of was the fact that, and I believe it was David Shayler that said, that Blair had worked for Mi5, and I thought it was interesting that film sort of hinted at that. Although I think in the film it's presented as working for the CIA, the Pierce Brosnan character, who's veiled, supposed to be a Tony Blair type character. Did you, when you guys were doing the whistleblowing, did you feel like it was that you'd gotten in over your head, or did you feel like the entire time, well, this is completely justified?
It's been over our head. There's no doubt about it. When we first took the decision to go public, it was very freeing to see it. It took a lot of searching to do it. We knew what the repercussions would be on a legal level. But we also had sort of confidence because in 1997, Tony Blair's government just won a historic Labour landslide in the UK. Mm-hmm. And many of them have been on the receiving end of spying by MI5. Many have voted against MI5 measures in the past. So we assumed that they would give us a fair hearing, take the evidence, and have an inquiry into our delusion of that illegality. They didn't, in fact. They were far more draconian in their response than even a conservative or right-wing government probably would have been, which was interesting.
Well, yeah, that chapter in your book is really fascinating.
Yeah, it was quite something. But I mean, I do think there is, there's a tendency on more liberal left-wing governments to crack down harder because they can get away with it on things like civil liberties and anti-surveillance laws. And the right-wing tends to be, a bit more sort of pussyfooting around it. But I don't know, it's a strange historical anomaly. But yes, so we thought we'd get a fair hearing, or a fairer hearing, although we knew we risked imprisonment by doing what we did. But also the timing was somewhat unfortunate because Shayler had sort of calculated that, yes, they would react probably quite quickly. Probably Mi5 insist on taking out a media injunction, stifle any further disclosures.
Right.
In fact, they did within a week.
Right.
And that would lead to the mainstream media at the time getting angry and saying, well, what about the free press? You can't gag us. We're trying to look at criminality. And that did seem to begin to work. Unfortunately, after the injunction was taken up, because Diana died in Paris, and any other story in the media just evaporated for weeks. So we sort of found ourselves on the run during that any support or pressure politically to hold an inquiry for the disclosures. So yes, in terms of timing, it was unfortunate.
in the trial, when I was reading one of the Guardian articles, Shayler mentions the possibility of writing a fiction story, which I believe he was going to write it as fiction, and then he sort of gets grilled over this by the attorney. What's one of the things that I like to do at my blog is sort of row through different works of fiction, be it films or literature, looking for certain patterns and looking for sort of premonitions or preemptive fictional stories that sort of mirror or mimic or predict actual events. And so I was just wondering, given that you were also very much involved in the classics and then that you obviously love literature, do you think that when this is done, and I think a lot of this is obviously done purposefully, do you think that it's like with the news stories that are leaked? Is this something that's done generally from a planned perspective, or is this something that happens just sort of extemporaneously? Is it just something that just sort of happens through the creativity of the human spirit, or is a lot of this, in terms of the mass media, done by design? What some people call predictive programming, if you will.
Well, it was a spy literature.
Well, not just spy literature, but I mean all kinds of literature, and especially films.
No, I'm sure. I mean, the whole idea of grooming people to accept new ideas, and use art and their description as an vanguard for that. I mean, one of the things I used to joke regularly about was the program Big Brother. I don't know if you have that in the US, where a bunch of strangers in the house, they seven, and they can win a prize.
Right.
And I used to sort of joke about that being, this is something that we're being groomed to aspire to, the civilians, every day, for hours, even when we're asleep. Because if you win, if you survive the course, you get a big payout, and you get to go to Z-list celebrity parties. Isn't that something to aspire to? So, the notion of Big Brother as bad from the world's north suddenly becomes subsumed in this idea of this is something to aspire to, micro-celebrity in me.
Sure, yeah, well, I think, go ahead.
No, I was just going to pick up on the sort of other grooming. I mean, it's funny, I mentioned on the car earlier, at Northwest, he had worked for Mi5 now because he was in the late early 60s and then went on to write these amazing spy novels. And he actually created a sort of vocabulary that the spies even use now, like the idea of the watchers and things like that for surveillance.
Right.
So he's reinvented that genre, so it became life imitating art.
Yes.
And with Shayler's, he wrote a book, The Organisation, which was also banned, even though it was fiction. It was banned by Mi5.
Right.
He wrote intimidating letters to all the major UK publishers at the time, saying not publish it might damage national security. And his fictional work was about the organisation, which is the secretive, evil organisation behind the public face of MI6 that can go around Britain and killing people, assassinating people. And he did genuinely write the fiction as a sort of romp around London. But, since then, he did begin to wonder if perhaps he touched a nerve.
Right.
Especially now that we know that so many private intelligence organisations, sort of mercenaries of the intelligence world, Kroll, Intelligence, and Aegis, and Backwater famously rebranded as Z, have taken on that mantle of undeniable work.
So, well, I guess I'm going to have to go ahead and probably wrap this up pretty soon, and this has been fascinating. I think this is, I mean, I'd really like to maybe get you back sometime and go into more depth about some of these other issues. What are you reading right now? What's on your coffee table that you're into?
What am I reading right now? Piece of fiction. Set in the Victorian era.
Victorian fiction, really?
It's just a design Michelle and called The Criminal and the Wife. It's a sort of rant about the hypocrisy of the Victorian era and prostitution, strangely enough.
That sounds interesting. Well, I want to.
That's my reading, and then generally I just hoover up any media stuff I can find about intelligence and civil liberties and things to keep current with what's going on, so I continue to commentate.
Do you have any books in the works? Anything that's going to be coming out anytime soon?
Not at the moment, no. Most of what I do, my writing, even things up the newspapers occasionally, if I can get past the censors, or more likely on my website. And please, if people want to read in more depth about many of these issues, it's just AnnieMachon.com.
Yeah, it's AnnieMachon.com, right?
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for being so gracious as to talk with me. I really appreciate your analysis and what you've done, and I think you've done a lot of good work. And I would recommend your book. I mean, you can still find it on Amazon: Spies, Lies, and Whistleblowers, Mi5, Mi6, and the Shayler Affair.
Yes, the publishers have sort of rather mucked up the spread of that book, but I am thinking about putting an electronic version for free on my website soon, so if people want to keep an eye out for it. I just need to go through the text to make sure that none of the blacked out bits slip in by accident.